So John Wilkinson again, and History Made Easier again. And this is the second part to Ian Kershaw's Fateful Choices. Stalin Decides, He Knows Best. Spring and Summer 1941. Stalin chose to distrust the intelligence given him from a variety of sources, and to trust his own judgment based on German disinformation and his own belief that no attack would come without a set of demands first. Stalin was also convinced that Hitler would not attempt to defeat the Soviet Union with its vast expanse of territory through blitzkrieg. Consequently, Hitler would need more time to build his stock of war materials. As for British reports that an attack was imminent, he saw this as nothing more than an attempt to provoke the Soviet Union and Germany into war. As for the German troops massing on the border, these, he thought, were part of Hitler's way of pressurizing the Soviet Union to provide Germany with more materials. So, when German reconnaissance planes started photographing Soviet air bases, and there were 200 such flights, Stalin refused to allow any action to be taken against them. Even when reports came in that the Germans were building rafts and pontoon bridges on the river frontier with Poland, Stalin wasn't convinced. On the evening of June the 21st, with reports from deserters informing them that the attack would begin early the following morning, Generals Timoshenko and Zhukov went to see Stalin in a desperate attempt to get him to put the Soviet troops in a state of combat readiness, moving troops into forward defensive positions, camouflaging aircraft, and preparing blackouts. Zhukov had a draft order already prepared. It so happened that the Politburo were gathering for a meeting that evening, but even with all evidence pointing towards a full-scale attack, neither they, the Politburo, nor Stalin were willing to provoke the Germans. By the time an order was sent, which was only to assume a state of alert and to man the frontier posts, the Germans had cut communication cables, and few Red Army units ever received the order. The result would be catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Roosevelt decides to wage undeclared war, the summer and autumn of 1941. In the months after Lend-Lease, Roosevelt made more critically important decisions. In July, American troops occupied Iceland to better protect America's sphere of influence. And in September, Roosevelt announced that American warships would protect convoys, and not just American convoys, crossing the Atlantic. And what was more, if German ships were spotted in waters under American protection, they would be considered a threat. It was, without using the words, a shoot-on-sight policy. Meanwhile, Roosevelt had sent Harry Hopkins, a man very close to him, a man he trusted deeply, to Moscow to meet with Stalin. It was a meeting of the utmost importance, and one that left Hopkins, and later Roosevelt, convinced that America should support the Soviet Union. Hopefully doing so would lead to Hitler's defeat without direct American involvement. So in October, Roosevelt extended Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. In November, he also oversaw amendments to the Neutrality Act, passed in 1939 when war in Europe broke out. This led to the arming of merchant ships and to American ships sailing into combat zones. Every step of the way, Roosevelt had to steer American policy through a skeptical Congress, also keeping a very careful eye on public opinion. But he had successfully steered America towards support of not only the democracies, but the Soviet Union. It was no mean achievement, and it was so important to the newly forged anti-fascist alliance. Japan decides to go to war, autumn 1941. Across Japanese society, the elite, particularly in the armed forces, the business community, and the Japanese public at large, the call for an Asian empire for dominance in Southeast Asia only grew louder. There would be a new order in Southeast Asia, and America mustn't be allowed to stand in Japan's way. The oil of the Dutch East Indies was the big prize. Without it, Japan would be reliant, or would remain reliant, on American oil, and America's stance vis-à-vis Japan meant that supply line was highly unlikely to continue. But asserting itself over the British and French, who had long seen themselves as racially superior to Asians, was a factor too. Besides, if Japan was not to go on the offensive, they would also be obliged to lose their gains in China. Still, expanding its dominion throughout Southeast Asia was a gamble, and there were voices urging a diplomatic solution. However, they were drowned out. General Tojo, head of the Japanese government since October 1941, put Japan's choice succinctly when he argued that Japan would become a third-class nation after 2 or 3 years if we just sit tight. But as with Hitler's decision to attack Russia, if Japan was to make a move in Southeast Asia, victory had to be achieved quickly. Hence, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor was made. But longer term, Japan had started down the path that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hitler decides to declare war on the United States, autumn 1941. With Germany finding it increasingly difficult to defeat the Soviet Union, and Japan opting for war in Southeast Asia rather than attacking the Soviet Union itself from the east, why did Hitler immediately declare war on America following Pearl Harbor? Hitler was not obliged by the Tripartite Pact to join Japan in its war against America. It was a defensive pact. But the Germans had been in discussions with the Japanese about an aggressive pact, and Hitler felt that the Tripartite Pact would be dead if he didn't respond with a declaration of war. Still, he waited until he'd received an assurance from the Japanese that neither side would seek an armistice or a peace agreement without the other's consent. Hitler also thought that given America's undeclared war in the Atlantic, a German declaration of war would enable him to let loose his U-boats on the Americans. This way, the Germans could still win the Battle of the Atlantic. But Germany could have taken a more aggressive stance without a declaration of war, and America would still have needed to supply 2 war fronts. But war with America had become inevitable. Hitler always thought it would be, and it's important to note that Roosevelt prioritized the war in Europe over that in the Pacific. So, the sooner war was declared, the better chance Germany had of winning the war in Europe, as the more America got involved, the harder that would be. It was better also to sell it to the German people as a German initiative. There was, however, also Hitler's ego to consider. A great power doesn't allow another power to declare war on it. It declares war itself. It wasn't the most decisive decision of the war, in that Germany's calamity was already made, but it was significant, and America's entry into the European war would make a big difference, as it had done in World War I. Hitler decides to kill the Jews, summer into autumn 1941. Jews were, from the outset of war, a specific target. Hitler had warned that if war broke out, it would lead to the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe, and he was determined to carry out his threat. There are no records of when, where, and by whom decisions were made. It was not the nature of the Nazi regime to formalise such things, and if any records were kept, and some must have been, they were destroyed as the regime itself was being destroyed. But Hitler was the man who made all key decisions in the Nazi regime, and Himmler and Heydrich were the architects of this particular policy. And we can put a date, a place and names to the Wannsee Conference that organised the mass murder of Europe's Jews. So we at least know that the decision had been taken before January 1942. Indeed, it must have been made by December 1941, when the original Wannsee Conference was to be called for. With the Madagascar plan dead in the water, the plan to send Jews off to Madagascar and let them rot, German thinking moved to shifting the Jews to some point in Russia's eastern wastelands, where they could be left to freeze to death, or else die of starvation, disease, or whatever, just as they would have done in Madagascar, and just as long as they died. By early 1941, a final solution to the Jewish question was openly talked about amongst the Nazi leadership. And with the invasion of the Soviet Union, it became a fundamental objective. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler made abundantly clear, would be a war of annihilation. The work of the Einsatzgruppen was the means by which the policy would first be carried out. But the sheer number of Jews in Eastern Europe would necessitate that another, more efficient and more immediate means be found, though using the Jews as slave labour was also seen as an acceptable way of putting them to use before killing them. What led to the death camps, the mass murder of Europe's Jews, was the halting of the German juggernaut at the gates of Moscow in December 1941. The bombing of Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on America would also most likely have been contributing factors. For it meant that the plan to deport them to the Russian wastelands, like the Madagascar plan before it, was no longer an option. And Germany was now in a rush to rid Europe of Jews before the Americans got involved. So the only option left was to murder them. And around 6 million Jews would be murdered. So there you have it. I'm sure you can see the value of this piece. Whether you're answering a question on the way the war unfolded, the way World War II developed into a global conflict, whether you're looking at the way the war was won and lost, the nature of the war, I think this piece can only add to the kind of response that you can give. So as always, I thank you for listening, and as always, I remind you to check out my History Made Easier website. But for now, cheers.